been a somber start to 2020, globally as well as in India. And this has been reflected in the Eurasia Group's list of top 10 risks of 2020. Now, Eurasia Group puts out this list every year and is considered the hallmark on reading geopolitical situations for global investors. India has made it to the list this year at number 5. The report says India under Prime Minister Modi is the 5th biggest geopolitical risk of 2020. In fact, placed ahead of the situation in Iran, that is at number 8. The report cites controversial policies taken up by the Modi government in its second term as a reason for this instability. To get more perspective on this report and its findings, I'm pleased to be joined now by Ian Bremmer, President of Eurasia Group and co-author of this report. Ian, great to have you on the show and thank you for speaking with us.
My pleasure. I'm glad we could finally make this work.
Let's begin by understanding why India is on this list and why at number 5.
Well, let's first talk about why we order the risks the way we do. There are 3 ways to think about it. The first is the likelihood of the risk. The second is the imminence, how soon it is to occur. And the third is the impact, the scale. And you put those things together. So you don't see Yemen on this list. The situation in Yemen is dramatically worse than almost anywhere in the world because the scale of the impact is pretty low. India is a major economy, and not only that, but it's a country where a lot of people around the world, Eurasia Group has included, over the last few years and over Modi's first term, was expected to do considerably better, was moving in a much more market favorable, economically favorable trajectory, and that has changed significantly. So it's not risk number 1, number 2, or number 3, but 5, in part because of the scale, in part because of the change in the trajectory, the fact that there's so much more focus on nationalism, on populism, on the conflict between Hindus and Muslims inside the country, the conflict over Kashmir, as opposed to talking about the economic opening of India, the ability of the Indians to start to make up some of the gap that they've lagged so much behind China in terms of development over the past decades. Clearly not something we're going to be talking about this year.
So the interesting part of your analysis is also how you've linked it to economic policies and decisions. And you talk about India's decision to pull out of RCEP. And in your analysis, it's something which has been pushed by the RSS. Can you explain what link you see between these controversial social policies and decisions, many of them which, by the way, were in the BJP's manifesto, so people who voted for them knew that this was possibly coming, and the economic situation that India finds itself in?
Well, the fact is that a lot of populism, both in India and around the world, is focused on building up domestic industry, concern about having to reduce subsidies and price imbalances between your own domestic constituents and those abroad. Look, we know that more open trade leads to more growth. But frequently, that undermines local constituencies. And unless you have a government that's prepared to smooth life for those people, they're going to be opposed to it. It's the reason why Trump decided to leave the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the reason why Obama couldn't get it done. And it's the reason why Modi decided not to bring the Indians into RCEP. Look, there's no question that not joining RCEP is an economic negative for Indian development over time. But it's also clear the Indians were very unhappy about the idea of having to reduce tariffs, change prices as a consequence of joining. And this was a popular move for Modi's base. It was a popular move for the RSS. And we think that is part of a shift. I mean, India was quite close. There were a lot of debates right up until the end as to whether they'd be able to get the Indians to join or not. Look, the United States, frankly, is perfectly happy with a weaker RCEP. The U.S. right now is orienting towards bilateral negotiations. Trump is saying, let's work with Modi individually. Let's talk about getting more Harley Davidsons into India, right? I mean, let's get more ag And at the margins, that's going to matter. But of course, the future of India's economy is largely about Asia, and you want India to be more integrated into Asian infrastructure, into Asian trade. And to the extent that Modi's decided that RCEP is not a part of that, that's going to hurt India's economic development. It's one of several reasons why India deserves to be a top risks globally this year.
It might sound repetitive, but I really want to get your perspective on this one sentence in the report where you say Prime Minister Narendra Modi has spent much of his second term promoting controversial social policies at the expense of an economic agenda. Now, if I were to play devil's advocate, a government representative today, if they were on the show, may say that, look, we cut corporate rate taxes. We've listened to what industry has to say. We've implemented GST. We're working on it. We've brought in the bankruptcy code. We're fixing things. We're trying to get ourselves out of the mess. How do you see the link between these social policies and the economic situation?
Look, when Modi first came into power, there's absolutely no question that the focus overwhelmingly was we need to build the Indian economy. In Gujarat, I've led 10% double-digit growth. I brought investment in from countries all over the world, even from countries like Japan that otherwise couldn't make it in an underdeveloped economy like India. I'm going to make things easier for people in India. One of the fact that Modi is uncorrupt, and the fact that the ministers around him are uncorrupt is a story that really meant something given the history of all political parties across India. And I think that's consistent. Certainly, we don't talk about the fact that Modi has suddenly turned towards being on the take in his second term. But the goods and service tax, which absolutely they rolled out across the country, it should have been done decades ago. It finally was a big piece of why we think India is becoming a little bit more competitive internationally. They've built more infrastructure.
Yeah.
But I would also argue that in a context where we now have much lower Indian economic growth, the decision of Modi to try to move away from that and towards I'm going to be a Hindu nationalist first and foremost, that's the way I win my re-election. And I win big. And it worked out for him. But that's now his focus. And we see it in terms of stripping autonomy in Kashmir. We see it in terms of recent migration policies. We see it in terms of citizenship policies. Look, I've got a photo right here. It's kind of funny. With here he is, my good friend. And your former governor of the central bank of India, right, who was working with Modi and left the government. And he left the government in part because he really believed that economic reforms were no longer going to be the future of India, that it was going to be hard to do his job successfully. He's a world-class economist. Any Indian leader would be fortunate to have this guy, and yet he moved away. And I think, unfortunately, I think you're going to see that for a lot of investors as well, that India was a story that they've been burned on for decades. When Modi came in, they were feeling maybe this is a guy that we should start paying attention to. And now he's focusing more on his own personal political platform and local support than he is the long-term future of India. And I think that's a misfortune.
Ian, you almost sound like you have buyer's remorse because you're one of those people who was very excited about Modi. You had an interesting perspective in that now controversial Time magazine piece. And just to put that argument again, a lot of the things that the Prime Minister is doing are things which have been in his party's manifesto both in 2014 and 2019 as well. This was not a secret that all of these social policies are on their agenda.
That's right.
Is it that a lot of global investors and people who watch this space, yourself included, thought it was just political rhetoric and they wouldn't go through with it?
Well, there's a question of priorities. You've got a very broad platform and you say a lot of things, but what are you going to actually work on? Obama decided to do healthcare as opposed to infrastructure. I think that was a mistake because he couldn't deal with the underlying healthcare issues that made it sustainable over the long term. And he still made it a political football where America desperately needed the infrastructure investment. He didn't do it. Bush didn't do it. Trump isn't doing it. Look, Bolsonaro. There are a lot of things about the Brazilian president that I personally find distasteful. He's not personally very much of a Democrat in the sense of liberal and open institutions. He's more pro-military. He says horrible things about gay rights. He's kind of a misogynist in terms of his attitude towards women. I don't like what he does on education. But in terms of economic reform, he's probably the most comprehensive reformer that we've seen across the entire emerging market space. And his term so far in Brazil has been a success. And it's been a success because he's gotten pension reform done, and he's doing microeconomic reform, sanitation reform, VAT reform, privatizations, and he personally is not corrupt, even though he's had some issues with his family. I mean, overall, you should have the ability as an analyst to say there are some things about a leader that I like and some things about a leader that I don't like. And the reason I push back against this idea of buyer's remorse is that implies that somehow I was in the pocket of Modi, and then I'm not. I don't take any money from these people.
That's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying at all.
I don't have a political party. But I think that it was legitimate to say that Modi was on balance better for India than other leaders were going to be when he came in, and those things have shifted. And when things change, and one of the biggest things that's changed is that India's second quarter growth this last year was 4.5%. It was 8% first quarter a year before. That's a big difference. And I think that Modi, in part, is responding because the economic juice doesn't get him the political benefits that it did a few years ago. So, yeah, he was always a nationalist. He wasn't even allowed in my country because of his history around Hindu nationalism and treatment of Muslims. So I'm highly aware of that, but that doesn't mean that he couldn't be an effective leader of India if it wasn't going to be the way he governed. And now we're seeing that's his priority.
All right, so let me ask you what you hope to see next. As I speak with you, the government's advanced GDP estimates for this year are at 5%. We're obviously in the middle of a slowdown, and the government's working on what to do next, etc. What do you think the Modi government should do with all of the political heft it currently has? What would you like to see?
Well, should is a very hard question because, should, if I'm advising Modi on how to make sure that he's popular, my God, his policies in Kashmir are incredibly popular among Hindus. Indians inside the country, Indians outside the country. In the U.S., Modi, you remember that Howdy Modi thing he did in Texas. Heck, they probably had more people show up than they did for Trump's inauguration. Trump flew down to Texas to ride Modi's coattails. I'd never seen that with another Indian leader, right? So, you can't argue if you're advising Modi that this is a bad thing for him to do, looking just at his political success. But as someone who cares more about the world than I care about India or than I care about the United States, I'd rather see him more inclusive. I'd rather see him governing for all Indians. I don't want to see India become a country only for Hindus or Hindus first. 15% of India is Muslim.
Yes.
And we see
what would you like the government to do in terms of economic policy, which you think could shake India out of the slump? What are the kind of measures you would like to see on the economic front?
Well, I clearly want to see them moving more towards comprehensive trade deals and integration. So I want them in RCEP, and I want them taking the economic measures domestically to make them a leader of RCEP, not just a taker of rules, right? I want to see ease of doing business internationally. I want to see tax code simplification. Right? I want to see bankruptcy code simplification. I want to see more money into the judiciary so that cases can get tried expeditiously and it's not seen as a black hole for for foreigners coming in. And I want to see more money into infrastructure. Still, India only spends 10% of what the Chinese do on infrastructure domestically. They're not catching up. They're falling farther behind from the Chinese every year, every month, every day. And so even though you have 1.4 billion people, you're not close. I also want to see India spending a lot more money in technology. I mean, India still has some of the top higher education institutes of any country in the world for the 0.1%. But literacy isn't what it needs to be. STEM education for the average Indian isn't what it needs to be. And you're falling way behind. Today, there are only two countries that matter in technology, the US and China. America's allies don't matter, and India doesn't matter. And that's a horrible thing for a country with 1.5 billion people to be irrelevant in terms of the future of high tech. You're going to have to choose the American or the Chinese system, and you won't be a part of it. You won't be leaders. And that's not what we want to see from a country that should have such potential as India. I'm going to be in Mumbai just next week. I travel to India all the time, but it's really hard. I mean, given that you're talking about a fifth of the global population, and I mean, internationally, it just doesn't play anywhere close to that weight, and it's not going to. And that's the big disappointment of India. That's why India ranks number 5 this year. You know, not to shake the Indians out of their lethargy, but just to recognize that they're really under participating, and they're doing it at a time that the world is going to deal with some really significant global challenges. The geopolitical environment's going to get worse. Economic growth is softening, and climate change is becoming a big deal. How does India, without the resources, without the human capabilities to deal with that, and without the leadership right now, you're going to just count on Hindu nationalism to get you through that? Good luck. Right? That's a real problem.
Well, very, very clear and strong words there. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, Ian. And, you know, one line from the introduction of the report where you say that never before in generations have you seen so many negative trend lines altogether. So let's hope for better times. And of course, when you're in Mumbai, please do come visit us at our studios. We'd love to have you over. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
I'll tell you one thing, you wouldn't be doing this interview the same way if it was in China. India still has that going for it.
Absolutely.
And we should appreciate it.
Absolutely. That's something we pride ourselves on. Thank you so much, Ian, for speaking with us.